Really, the 1960s starts to unravel before we even get to the end of the decade. And one of the most important years in the 1960s and in world history and American history is 1968. There's a lot of things that happen in 1968 that are pivotal moments in US history. When it comes to our involvement in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive, taking place during the Vietnamese holiday of Tet, was an intense attack by the Viet Cong against Americans, which escalated our involvement in Vietnam and increased the unpopularity of the war. Following the Tet Offensive and years of American body count piling up, along with the futility, right, of the war, of our lack of progress in Vietnam, peace talks start in 1968. And because of Vietnam, LBJ decides, or Lyndon Baines Johnson decides, that he will not run for reelection, even though he still could, because remember, he had only been elected once. He'd also finished out Kennedy's term. 1968 is also a year of prominent political assassinations. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed in Memphis while he was there to organize a Poor People's March to highlight issues of poverty. King's death will spark a wave of riots across the United States and inner cities. Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, who was running for the Democratic nomination for president on an anti war platform, is shot and killed at a campaign event by a Palestinian nationalist. If you've ever heard the 1960s song Abraham, Martin, and John, Abraham refers to Abraham Lincoln, Martin to Martin Luther King Jr., and John to John F. Kennedy, referring to this wave of people who were taken before their time due to assassinations. Well, Kennedy was assassinated before the Democratic National Convention. However, the Democratic National Convention is very tumultuous and chaotic. There are a lot of anti war protests by activists who want to ensure that the eventual nominee adopts a platform of ending the war in Vietnam. 8 of the protesters are arrested when a riot breaks out at the Democratic National Convention outside of the convention. 8 of these protesters are arrested and charged with inciting violence. However, their initial convictions are later overturned, and it is revealed that it was actually a lot of undercover law enforcement who had played a role in sparking the violence. So, in 1968, the Democrats will pick Hubert Humphrey, who was Lyndon Baines Johnson's vice president. He's not profoundly anti war, especially not in comparison to Robert Kennedy or Eugene McCarthy, who were also initially in contention for the Democratic nomination. This chaotic year of 1968 will contribute to a climate of concern over how radical the 60s had gotten, how chaotic and violent and out of control the United States seemed to be. And this will launch the very beginnings of a modern conservative movement. Richard Nixon, who runs as the Republican candidate in 1968, will talk about what he calls a silent majority. He feels the vast majority of Americans did not support the more radical movements in the 1960s, felt that the 60s had gone too far in challenging social norms, had gone too radical in rights movements. And so Nixon campaigned on this strategy of law and order. And he ended up winning the 1968 election by a slim margin in the popular vote of 43%. George Wallace, the Southern governor who ran as an independent, won 13% of the popular vote on a platform that was largely a reaction against civil rights movements. So Nixon, even though he takes office in 1968, right before the technical end of the decade, will definitely start to shift American society more into the 1970s, and again, the rise of conservatives in American politics at that point in time. So, what exactly is the legacy of the 1960s? Well, for one thing, Americans now were talking freely and openly about lots of different controversial issues that they kind of stuffed down in that culture of conformity in the 1950s. So Americans were having much more frank conversations on issues like race, poverty, and sex. There was a lot of discussion about the responsibilities of government, and particularly the relationship between citizens and their government that were sparked by the 1960s. And this swing towards conservatism that we start to see with the election of Richard Nixon, and we'll see in full force in the 70s, and then come to national prominence with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, this modern conservative movement will look back at the 1960s and essentially blame the 60s for a lot of America's social ills. They see the 60s not as an era of protest movements, of wanting to expand civil rights, but rather this era of cultural and moral decay and decadence. But more on that in a future class. When we come back next time, we'll be talking about the presidency of Richard Nixon, how even though Nixon had run on a campaign that he would get us out of Vietnam, that doesn't happen immediately. And we'll talk a little bit more about the president, better known as Tricky Dick, when we come back next time. Until next time, I'm Dr. S. Mocker.